In this video, we're going to talk about Keynesian economics after Keynes. The basic model that we have in macroeconomics is known as the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, or sometimes called the general equilibrium model. And this comes directly from Keynes. But in the 1950s, a number of economists worked to formalize Keynes' system, formalize the theories that Keynes talked about in the General Theory, and they did so largely by adding mathematics and graphs and more discipline and more formality to his system. And the result of that is what's known as the aggregate demand or aggregate supply model, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply system. In this model, we have aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is the total demand and total supply that exists in the economy, and when those are in balance, we have general equilibrium. Now, the important thing is that when those are not in balance, that's when we have either unemployment or inflation or problems with business cycles. So we can look at aggregate demand to start. Aggregate demand is equal to all the demand for goods and services in the economy. And the way this works is that we assume that it's equal to all the income in the economy, because the incomes in the economy are earned, and then people use those incomes to then demand things. And so there's kind of an equivalence between the amount of income that happens in the economy and the aggregate demand. And it's also equal to the amount that everybody spends on consumption and investment and government spending and net exports, that famous equation. So the quantity of real GDP demanded is equal to the amount of income and is equal to the amount of expenditures that happens in the economy. Now, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, like all demand curves, meaning when the price level is higher, the aggregate demand is lower. And when the price level is lower, the aggregate demand is higher. And this is because of a number of reasons. One is the wealth effect. When prices are higher, when the price level is higher, then the real wealth people have is less. And in order for them to rebalance or restore their basket of goods and services that they demand, that they want to buy, they have to increase some of their savings. Maybe they'll decrease spendings. They'll rebalance things. And so when the price level is higher, it's the same thing as their incomes being lower. And we know when people's incomes are lower, they demand less of everything. And this is true for aggregate demand as well as individual demand. The second reason is what's known as the intertemporal substitution effect. When the price levels rise, well, that decreases the real value of money. The purchasing power is less when the price level is higher. And so that will raise the interest rate. And so people are going to borrow and spend less money. And then lastly, there's an international effect. When the price levels are higher, the price of domestic goods and services relative to foreign goods is lower, so we might import more things and export less things, and so the net exports will decline and aggregate demand will decline with as well. So what does aggregate demand depend upon? Well, it depends upon many factors. It depends upon the price level. The law of demand holds. When the price level is higher, aggregate demand is less. When the price level is lower, aggregate demand is more. But it also depends upon other things. Expectations, fiscal policy and monetary policy, and things that are happening in the global economy. So first we can think about expectations. Any changes to expectations about people's future income, about future inflation, about future profits that firms and businesses may earn is going to change aggregate demand. When people expect their incomes to rise, they're going to demand more things now, and so aggregate demand is going to increase now. When people expect inflation to be higher tomorrow, well, they're going to demand more things now. If they think inflation is high now and it's going to be lower in the future, they may demand less now, and because they're waiting for inflation to decline and prices to decline, and they'll demand more things later. And if businesses are expecting profits to be higher, then they're going to invest more now in order to realize those profits. So any one of those changes in expectations about income or about inflation or about future profits can make aggregate demand less or more. Fiscal policy is when governments use spending to achieve macroeconomic objectives. So if the government is spending more, the G component that makes up expenditures, that's part of aggregate demand, will be greater, and aggregate demand will be greater. The same thing is true if there's a tax cut, or then there will be more money in the system, and people will have more of their own money, and they'll be able to, if their incomes will be higher, they'll be able to demand more, and so aggregate it will increase their disposable income, and the C component of aggregate demand will increase, and aggregate demand increases. Monetary policy is when the government attempts to use the amount of money or interest rates to achieve macroeconomic objectives. And so when monetary policy changes, that can also affect aggregate demand. If there's more money in the system, if the quantity of money is greater, well, at least initially, there's going to be more money in the system, and aggregate demand will increase. The same thing happens when there's a cut in interest rates. If interest rates are lower because of monetary policy, well, then it's easier for people to borrow money and make investments, and so the I component of aggregate demand will increase, and aggregate demand will get larger. And then lastly, the world economy. When exchange rates are falling, when the U.S. dollar is becoming weaker, that makes domestic goods less expensive to people in other countries, and so they'll export more, and that will increase aggregate demand. When income in other parts of the world is increasing, their demand for exports will increase aggregate demand. So all of these things can change aggregate demand, and we know that if the price level changes, well, then we have a movement along the curve. We might demand more or less, but the curves themselves don't change. But when one of those factors, like expectations, or fiscal policy or monetary policy or things that happen in the world economy change, well, then the whole curve will change. And when aggregate demand increases, it moves out to the right, AD1. And when aggregate demand decreases, it moves to the left, to AD2. Now let's talk about aggregate supply. The aggregate supply curve is the quantity of real GDP supplied at every price level. And in the long run, well, that's going to be equal to potential GDP. Potential GDP is the real GDP that's produced, that's created when we're at full employment. So we have this vertical line, and that represents the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's the amount of aggregate supply that's going to be supplied in the long run. It's the equivalent. It's the same as potential GDP. With aggregate supply, we also have a short-run aggregate supply curve, and that's upward sloping, and that is subject to the law of supply. The higher the price level, the greater is the amount of supply in aggregate, and the lower the price level, the less is the amount of goods and services supplied in the aggregate. So that's our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. It's also called the short-run aggregate supply curve. So the short-run aggregate supply curve intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve, it can be they can be equal to each other, like they are in point C, where the price level is 110, but the price level can be lower than that, in which case the quantity of real GDP supplied decreases, and we're going to operate below potential GDP. It can also be greater than 110. We could be at point D or point E, in which case the real GDP supplied increases. It increases beyond potential GDP, and so we can be at any point along the short-run aggregate supply curve, at potential GDP, below it, or above it. Now, aggregate supply will change because of a number of reasons. We know that if the price level changes, then we'll have a movement along the aggregate supply curve, but the curve itself doesn't move. What will cause the curve to move? Well, if we have a change in potential GDP, That can happen because we have more labor hours being worked in aggregate, or we have the same number of hours being worked, but people are more productive because of technology or some other reason. Well, then potential GDP is going to be greater. We also might have a change in aggregate supply because of a change to the money wage rate or one of the other factor prices. One of the other factor prices will cause um, aggregate supply to decrease or to increase, to change. And so if we have a change to potential GDP, and we can see here if we have an increase in the quantity of labor at full employment, well, then we're going to have maybe people are working more hours. The whole curve will move from the LAS to LAS1. The potential GDP, the whole long run aggregate supply curve moves, and the whole moves out to the right to LAS1. This will also happen if we have an increase in capital. That will make labor more productive, or an increase in technology, which increases productivity overall for labor. And any one of these things will increase both the long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. We can also see that changes to the money wage rate, a rise in the wage rate decreases the short run aggregate supply. Because an increase in wages, an increase in the wage rate is an increase in the prices of factor of production. So short run aggregate supply has to decrease. When the price of a factor of production increases, supply decreases. And so that's what happens when we have a change in the money wage rate. So in the short run, we have what's called a short run macroeconomic equilibrium, when the quantity of real GDP demanded equals the quantity of real GDP supplied. And that's point C on the graph here. This is when there's a balance between the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve. This is the short run macroeconomic equilibrium. If the real GDP is below the equilibrium GDP or the potential GDP, well, firms will increase production and they'll raise prices, bringing us from point A or B up to point C. If real GDP is above the equilibrium GDP at point D or E, well, then firms will decrease production and they'll lower prices. And so in the short run, the real GDP can be either greater or less than potential GDP. They can be beyond the potential GDP, or they can be less than potential GDP. But in the long run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when the real GDP equals potential GDP. When the economy is when the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, where aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply curve intersect each other at point B, intersect each other on the long run aggregate supply curve, where the economy is at potential GDP. So this is point B, is the long run macroeconomic equilibrium, when there's a complete balance between the aggregate demand curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, and the long run aggregate supply curve. This means the short run macroeconomic equilibrium is occurring when we're on the long term macroeconomic equilibrium, when we're at potential GDP, when the economy is operating at full employment. This is point B. So how does adjustment work? Well, if the economy is below full equilibrium on the left side, then the money wage rate will fall, and it'll keep on falling until the short run aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve again back on the long run aggregate supply curve. So we can be below full employment equilibrium, and there's an adjustment that happens. Wages will fall, the money wage rate falls, and as it falls, businesses will hire more and more workers. When the price of a factor of production, wages decreases, then then people can supply more. Businesses and firms can supply more, and so the short run aggregate supply curve it will increase. It'll move to the right, and eventually we'll get back to this equilibrium point, the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. The same thing happens if we're above or beyond potential GDP. We're above the full employment equilibrium. Here, the economy is overheated. The money wage rate has to rise, and as it rises, the short run aggregate supply curve decreases. Why? Because the price of a factor of production, labor, is increasing, and when a price of factor of production increases, supply decreases. And so that keeps happening until eventually we're back on we have the short run macroeconomic equilibrium at potential GDP on the long run aggregate supply curve, and we're back in balance. So you can see from what we've discussed here, we have this balance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the short run, and eventually aggregate supply in the long run. And when we're out of balance, well, we might have problems, but there's a mechanism for it to become back into balance and to move us back into a position where we're on the long run macroeconomic equilibrium, where we're at full employment and we're at potential GDP. So we can use this model to explain things like economic growth. How does economic growth happen? Well, economic growth happens when the quantity of labor increases, which increases potential GDP, or capital is accumulated, or technology advances. Both those things make labor more productive, and therefore will cause workers to be able to produce more at full employment. And so potential GDP increases, and the curve shifts rightward. This was how economic growth is explained in the ADAS model. We can also understand things like inflation in the ADAS model. So this is a case where the quantity of money grows faster than potential GDP. So if money is growing fast, aggregate demand increases more than the long run aggregate supply. So we have more money chasing fewer goods, and that results in inflation. This is because the aggregate demand curve shifts rightward faster than the shift of the long run aggregate supply curve. We can explain business cycles using the ADAS model. Business cycles occur because aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply fluctuate. You see, they might be in balance at some point, but aggregate demand and aggregate supply will fluctuate, but they don't do it in any sort of, they might do it somewhat randomly. And the money wage rate's not going to change rapidly enough to keep real GDP at potential GDP. So we're not always going to be at the full employment equilibrium. If real GDP is beyond potential GDP, where the economy is overheated, and when we have that situation, it's called an inflationary gap. When real when we're below the full employment equilibrium, real GDP is less than potential GDP. Now we're not producing all that we could be producing, and we call this a recessionary gap or a recession. So when aggregate demand fluctuates, the aggregate demand will move to the right. Firms will increase production because there's more demand, and the price level rises. And in this case, we now have an inflationary gap. The short run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs to the right of the long run or potential GDP. We're operating beyond full employment. This is when the economy is overheated and we have this inflationary gap. And what happens is the money wage rate rises. As wages rise, short run aggregate supply decreases. It keeps happening until the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve intersect each other at the long run aggregate supply back at potential GDP. We're at full employment. So when we have this inflationary gap, the price level will rise. It'll keep on rising, decreasing the short run aggregate supply curve and real GDP until we're back into the long run equilibrium. We're back at full employment and back at potential GDP. But notice in this case, we're back at potential GDP, but we have a higher price level. This is the result of the inflationary gap. Now, one of the important relationships in Keynes and in the ADAS model is called the Phillips Curve. In the Phillips Curve, the idea is that there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Keynes said we didn't have to worry about inflation while we had unemployment. We didn't have to worry about inflation until we reached full employment. So we could do spending, we could do fiscal policy, and we can keep doing it as long as we were below full employment, because if we were below full employment, there was no pressure on money wages. There was no way for that would not translate into any sort of inflationary gap or inflation, and we only had to worry about inflation once we reached full employment. So this was formalized by, it's called the Phillips Curve, after Keynes, basically showing that there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. We don't have to really worry about both at the same time. It's either one or the other. We either have high inflation and low unemployment, or we have low inflation and high unemployment, but not both. And then, so this was the model through the 1950s and 60s, but then in the 1970s we had a period where we did have both. So we had a decrease in GDP, we had high unemployment, and high inflation all at the same time. This wasn't supposed to be able to happen according to Keynes, according to the ADAS model and the Phillips curve, but it did. It was called stagflation, when we have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. Now, the explanation for this is that when you have a rise in a very important factor of production, one that was used really in all parts of the economy, something like oil, well, we have an increase in the price of a factor of production, then the short run aggregate supply curve will decrease, and it'll shift to the left. And now we have a new short run macroeconomic equilibrium, which represents a decrease in GDP and higher prices. So the economy experiences both inflation and recession at the same time. Inflation and unemployment at the same time. And we call this stagflation. So it's interesting. If we can, there's a quote by Fed chairwoman when she was the Fed chairwoman. She eventually became the Treasury Secretary. Janet Yellen, she said in the 2007 speech, the Phillips curve is a core component of every realistic macroeconomic model, this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. It's just accepted by economists, and it's a fundamental part of macroeconomics and the ADAS model. Except we have too many data points, which basically says this relationship, which was purported to exist, really doesn't hold up historically. There's as many cases where it's not the case as where it is the case, and that really doesn't make for very good macroeconomic modeling. And so this is the ADAS model, the model that is the main macroeconomic model for economics. Sometimes it's called the general equilibrium model, and hopefully you see that it comes directly out of Keynes's work. It's just more formal. And involves charts and graphs and mathematics and more formality, which makes it easier and better for us to work with. But it's essentially the same ideas that came from Keynes in the general theory.